Let's begin our next conversation looking at the aviation sector with news that Nigeria Airlines on Sunday said its Lagos-Abuja flight was diverted to Asaba, Delta State capital, due to poor weather conditions. The flight NUA 0504, which took off from the Murtala Mohammed International Airport Terminal 2, headed for Abuja, ended up being at the Asaba International Airport, leaving passengers worried and confused. It was later revealed online and by passengers that the pilot was given the wrong flight plan from Lagos, which led the cabin crew to confidently announce that we have arrived in Abuja.
Now, this led to what many have called damage control from the flight carrier in releasing a communique that says the situation was due to bad weather. Now, recall investigative journalist David Hundeyin a few months ago had been following the aviation space and revealed that issues surrounding the corrupt Air Nigeria deal with Ethiopia would eventually, of course, transcend to in other parts of the aviation sector. Recently, he listed the flight carriers that Nigerians must be wary of, stating that the NCAA is continuing the legacy left behind by its predecessor, Hadi Sirika. Joining us this morning is David Hundeyin. Good morning, David. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Okay. I think it might just be nice to start with the current biggest trending issue, the miscommunication and seemingly failed strategy to fix, what happened with United Airlines this past weekend. What from your investigation would you say has happened here or could have gone wrong?
So I've actually been able to gain access to the official statement that was written by the person responsible for the mix-up, the flight dispatcher. And as far as it's possible to tell, this is someone who has been severely overworked and in the heat of the overwork made a mistake which should have been caught, right? Because how the process is supposed to work is that regardless of whether the flight dispatcher makes an error on his report or not, which the report is sent to the flight crew, the captain is also supposed to verify everything in that report. So it's not as if the flight dispatcher alone holds all the responsibility. But in this case, the reason why this error was able to get to the extent that it did goes to the heart of the issues that exist in Nigerian aviation space. So in this case, it turned out that the captain or the flight crew was a wet leased flight crew. Wet lease means basically you're bringing in an aircraft and flight crew from outside the country who are completely foreign to operate in the country on basically a temporary basis. So this was a foreigner who knows nothing about Nigeria. So if you're telling this guy you're going to Abuja or you're going to Asaba, none of that makes any difference to him. He doesn't know where is Abuja, he doesn't know where is Asaba. So it's what you give him that he will just spit out. So even though the flight schedule clearly says Lagos to Abuja, the flight plan says Lagos to Asaba. As far as he's concerned, he's going to Asaba, right? He's not a local. He doesn't have local knowledge, and that goes to the heart. And for the fact that was then able to escalate to the point where a plane lands at the wrong location, and the announcement is made that thanks for flying with us. We've now landed at Nnamdi Azikiwe International Airport in Abuja. Meanwhile, you're 400 miles somewhere, south of Abuja. You're in Asaba. And you don't know. That goes to the heart of the issues that exist in Nigerian aviation space, which is why I think it's very important that people should know that this is not just an issue of a flight dispatcher who made a mistake, but this is not even just an issue of United Airlines having a substandard operation. This is a systemic issue within the Nigerian aviation space. Bear in mind that as soon as this issue made it to the public space, the first thing the NCAA did is that they announced that they had suspended the permission to given to United Airlines to operate wet leased aircraft in Nigeria. So already that tells you that they know what the issue is, and they've chosen to turn a blind eye all this time. The fact that a wet leased crew and a wet leased aircraft are operating in Nigeria without any sort of local knowledge or understanding of the geography, topography, airspace, anything, that in itself is a risk. If you speak to any aviation expert, if you have the opportunity to bring an aviation expert onto the show, they will tell you that most of the time, when there is a major aviation accident that causes loss of life, most of the time it's not due to one single catastrophic event or one single catastrophic error. It's a accumulation of tiny errors. So in this case, an overworked flight dispatcher who accidentally sent a flight plan, basically he copied and pasted a previous flight plan into the new flight plan and neglected to change the ABB, which is the call sign for Asaba, to ABV, which is the call sign for Abuja, right? That's a small error, which should have been caught at the very least by the captain, by the pilot. But it's a small error. However, where you have several small errors like that, which then meet and compound each other, that's how you eventually get the circumstances that lead to an accident.
All right. So just before you go on, because I'm going to have us expand further on, the fears of accidents and whatnot. But before you go on, and Olive is going to come in next. But I want you to just add a little bit. I'm a little confused, and this is please forgive my ignorance. When a flight is going to be landing in Asaba, there is meant to be information to the air traffic controllers in Asaba, expecting this flight. Isn't that how it works? Because if the flight was meant to go to Abuja and then eventually found its way to Asaba, do they just hear that there's a plane coming to Asaba? Are they meant to be aware that there's a plane coming in from somewhere else to Asaba before it lands?
So I was actually lucky enough to speak to someone who has some insights as to what happened at Benin Airport, which is nearby. Because if you're flying to Asaba, you will fly through the Benin Airport airspace. And what I was informed was that the captain of the flight was convinced actually that he's heading to Asaba. Like they went back and forth with him several times. There was a bit of almost an argument in air because they were confused that we don't expect United Airlines to be flying to this part of the country because United Airlines doesn't fly to Benin, doesn't fly to Asaba normally. They're trying to expand their operations, so they're trying to expand to Benin, but that hasn't been finalized yet. So all of a sudden, here's an Airbus heading into the Benin airspace. What's going on? And the captain was insistent that, well, this is his flight plan. He's going to ABB. He's going to Asaba. So eventually, it's like under Nigerian civil aviation law. Any aircraft which is in flight is under the full operational control of the captain. So the captain is legally allowed to overrule anyone, including ground staff and flight controllers. So eventually, the captain has said that this is where he's going. So like, okay, well, you know better. And then they land, and then an announcement is made that, hey, we're at Nnamdi Azikiwe Airport in Abuja. And then very quickly they realize, oh my God, there's been an almighty screw up. And here we are.
Okay, what would you say is the implication of this wet lease agreements? Do you also think that the banning of wet lease planes by the NCAA is sufficient penalty in this regard? I feel like this is a double barrel question. I also did see where reference was made to the fact that one of the suggestions to be able to handle situations like this and prevent this from happening is to ensure that there is at least one Nigerian or a local pilot on the flight. Do you think that this would suffice?
So is banning the wet lease or is withdrawing the wet lease permission sufficient penalty? No, it's not. It's a sticking plaster on what is essentially a cancer. First of all, I should mention that despite the loud announcements that they made that they've withdrawn the permission for United Airlines to operate a wet-leased aircraft, I can authoritatively inform you that today, a new wet-leased aircraft and crew for United Airlines is actually on its way into the country. I can tell you that authoritatively. I have the data. I can give you the tail identifier of the aircraft. Like, these things are not hidden. So essentially, the NCAA has done what it usually does, which is to take with its left hand and then quietly give back with its right hand. So due to public outcry and public outrage, we're going to do something that makes it look like we have applied the sanction. And then meanwhile, we're quietly going to revert to status quo. So they've taken away the permission for this one aircraft and then allowed them to bring in another aircraft. So in a few days' time, we're going to see United Airlines flying again with another wet leased aircraft and another wet leased foreign crew. So let's be clear about this. Nothing has changed. This is what the NCAA does, right? They are committed to preserving the status quo.
Yeah, but
now the second part of the question,
go ahead, please.
Yeah, the second part of the question, which was, will having a Nigerian crew member go some way toward addressing this? I believe it would. However, again, this is a systemic issue within the Nigerian aviation space. I'm hopeful that you get to bring an aviation industry insider who doesn't have the vested interest onto your show soon, and they can talk to you about the issues that Nigerian pilots face. For example, it's as a pilot who is trying to get a job in Nigeria, you will find that I'm not talking about small operators. Some of the biggest operators in the country, I don't want to mention their names, they sometimes make it such that you're a young pilot, you're trying to build your hours, you've just gotten maybe you're trying to get your type ratings or whatever. They are basically going to work you almost at an unpaid level, right? There is very little respect for Nigerian labor, even at that high level. So many of these operators find it much easier and much more expedient to just bring in a wet leased foreign crew to come and do everything for them. And by the way, the typical Nigerian pilot earns maybe 40, 45% of what their foreign counterpart makes in Nigeria. Right? Even if they have similar skill levels, even if they have similar flight hours, they exist at pretty much the same level. The foreigners get paid at a rate of double, generally speaking. You can confirm this from anyone within the industry. So there is very little respect, there's very little regard for Nigerian pilots and crew members in the space. So even though it would make sense that obviously you cannot have a local flight operating from Lagos to Abuja and every single crew member on the flight is foreign. That literally makes no sense whatsoever. That would seem to be common sense. But you will keep on saying that because in the Nigerian aviation space, it's always expedience over any sort of long-term planning.
All right, David. I think the key thing here, because I did also look at statistics with wet leasing across the world, and it seems to be a growing concept. So maybe it's not meant to be. It's not a bad idea in Nigeria. We just have to fix the other aspects, of the aviation sector to make it safer. But I also want to talk about I've seen reactions to some of your posts. There are people who say that you are fear mongering. Mr. Akion Lateru, I think is Director General of Nigeria Safety Investigation Bureau, I think a couple of months ago did say that Nigerian aviation sector is one of the best in Africa. It's one of the safest in Africa. We've had only 2 fatal, incidents in the last 10 years. A couple of, skidding off the runway here or there. But what would you say to those who say that you are simply fear-mongering? That Nigeria's aviation sector is not perfect, but it's not on the level that you're painting it to be, insulting these airlines and saying that disaster is going to happen very soon and whatnot.
So first of all, what I'd say to the fellow you mentioned is, first of all, that's not true. That's categorically not true. Nigeria's aviation space is actually one of the most unsafe, not in Africa, but in the world. In 2023 alone, you can count the number of major incidents. I'm not talking about minor incidents, major incidents that have happened. So let's count them. There's been a plane which lost two of its 3, its landing gear tripod lost 4 of its 6 wheels on touchdown. That was Max Air. I believe that was in May. In June, an aero contractor's Boeing 737 attempted to take off from Abuja with a broken horizontal stabilizer. That's a broken tail wing. And the pilot had to abort the flight and come back to the airport when he noticed that he was losing control. Again, I should stress that was a fully loaded flight, over 100 people on board. If the pilot had tried to press on with that flight, which I believe was heading to Yola, if he had continued, that would have been a fatal incident. 100 people at least would have died. Like 100% that would have happened, right? The fact that he was able to abort the flight and make it back to the airport in one piece, and that plane, by the way, has not flown since then. So if the person you mentioned considers that to be a success, considers that to be proof of how safe Nigerian airspace is, I think Nigerians should be very worried. If someone at that level is making statements like that. In the same month, I think that was in May as well, and an Air Peace aircraft taking off from Enugu lost one of its wheels as it was taken off because there was a pothole on the runway. And then not to mention the several incidents of runway excursions which we have witnessed over the past few weeks. Planes which landed and then, have skidded off the runway, or planes which didn't even make it to the runway, like the one which crash landed with the Minister of Power on board in Ibadan. There have been multiple incidents like this. And these are the ones that have been reported, because they are also
but here's the thing.
Should have been reported, unreported.
Yeah, I agree. But here's the thing. If we do, unfortunately, we probably wouldn't have those statistics. But if you do, an analysis of what it is like in, flying in Egypt, or flying in, I'm just call it random, African countries, can we argue that they have zero of similar issues? That, we don't have Egyptian Airlines or South African Airlines, commercial airlines, in these countries having these same issues here and there, where, one of them loses a tire, the other one, has its tail lights, broke, or tail, I don't know what the word is, broken every now and then. Why I'm saying so is because if we see that these things happen in bits and pieces across the continent, then can we then paint Nigeria with the brush that we're painting it with currently?
So I don't know if there was if you read a report which I published, I believe this was in August, which was called Nigeria's Downfall Airline and the NCAA's Down to Death. This was a story I published which focused on just one airline, but this is a microcosm of the wider Nigerian aviation space. So this was an airline which, after having those incidents, the airline which lost its wheel on landing, and then later on was found to have water inside the fuel tanks of its plane, with that horrible video that went viral.
Yes, I remember.
This same airline was then investigated by the NCAA. An audit report was published, and 48 major infractions were found in this airline's operation. I'm not talking about minor things, major infractions. Infractions like a spare part used to fix this particular problem has no serial number. So the NCAA cannot trace where this spare part originated from. Or the nitrogen cylinders used to fill the tires of the aircraft, because tires of an aircraft are filled with nitrogen, which is an inert gas. The nitrogen sourcing cannot be identified. So the airline cannot explain to the NCAA where it sourced this nitrogen from. So in other words, you don't even know whether what the gas that is in the tires that you're landing on is in fact nitrogen, or that the airline is sourcing aviation fuel from unlicensed sources. So the NCAA cannot trace the supply chain of the aviation fuel that this airline is using, or that the airline is using unlicensed technicians to carry out important maintenance work in its facility. Right? It's using technicians who don't have the certifications to do certain things to do them. The same way a Lagos mechanic would use his boy who is learning work to experiment on his customer's vehicle. But someone is doing this on a plane which is going to carry hundreds of people. This is in an NCAA audit report, which is public now. I put it out there. Or that this same airline is the technicians who are carrying out these functions don't have the visual certifications to do certain things. In other words, I think every 5 years, the technician doing certain maintenance tasks has to have a certification stating that their eyes are at a certain standard, right? And they do not have that certification.
Okay.
Right? That's a major issue. And all this was published. And this is the most important point. Before this audit report was even released, this airline was given permission to continue flying. And this airline is still flying today, right now, as we speak. None of these issues has been addressed. Systemic issues. It is in Nigeria's airspace now. If you go to MMA2 this morning, that airline is loading to Abuja right now as we speak. That is what is happening in Nigeria's airspace. So this is what I mean when I say that the players in the Nigerian aviation space are determined to maintain the status quo until inevitably, when that fatal accident happens, and then you start running around, this one accident investigation bureau, this one committee, this one probe. Meanwhile, all of this can be fixed right now proactively. But that's something we don't like doing in Nigeria.
Okay,
right?
so now let's even call names. You've mentioned some of these airlines. Some you've talked about in this conversation. Some you've mentioned on Twitter. You've talked about I've forgotten their name now. United Airlines, I beg your pardon. You talked about how they, of course, are still flying wet lease, even though there's, a claim officially that they've temporarily banned all wet lease planes. You've also talked about aero contractors, which you claim is still flying barely 4 months after trying to lift 100 passengers in a 737 with a broken tail wing. There's also several other airlines. You have Green Africa, which you said with its multiple boardroom issues and question marks over its maintenance habits. And you have referred to Max Air as probably the most dangerous airline in current operation on planet Earth. And you said that it's still flying. So I'd like you to sort of break this down for us. Maybe we'll start with Max Air and why you've referred to it as the most dangerous airline on planet Earth.
Okay, so the NCAA audit report that I just made reference to was actually an audit report on Max Air, right? And this is an audit report which even insiders, even within the NCAA, were so dismayed with the results of this audit report that normally when incidents like this happen, they find a way to try and soften it for the public or to try and prevent information from getting out so it doesn't get to journalists like me. This time around, it was people within the space, people from from within the Aviation Ministry, from within the NCAA itself, and from the Federal Airports Authority of Nigeria who actually reached out to me because they had access to these documents, obviously. And that's how I got access to this report. I'm looking at a copy of this report now. I guess after this interview is over, I'm also going to post a copy on my Twitter handle for those who haven't seen it before. 48 major infractions. I wish we had enough time so I'd be able to read out some of these infractions. Let me just read through.
Yeah, read out a few for us. Yes, please.
Yeah. So 1, use of expired fire extinguishers. 2, no evidence that newly installed landing gear on Boeing 737 with tail identifier 5N MHM is airworthy or serviceable. Max Air could not explain where it obtained the landing gear from and its operational history, but nonetheless fraudulently recorded its next overhaul date as 21,000 flight cycles or 10 years from May 2023. Replacement of damaged engine parts with the wrong parts following a bird strike incident on July 3. Cannibalizing a non-serviceable aircraft without an airworthiness certificate for spare parts. Use of a non-traceable part without a serial number to replace a damaged part. Failure to install fan blades in pairs as recommended, which could lead to engine imbalance and ultimately catastrophic in-flight engine failure. Use of engine fan blades without serial number. The origin of these blades cannot be traced by the NCAA. Use of unauthorized staff to carry out the engine ground run servicing procedure carried out during the, use of unauthorized staff to carry out the engine ground run servicing procedure, which is analogous to a downfall mechanic letting his apprentice warm the engine. That's just 7 of 48 major infractions in this NCAA report about Max Air. And before this report was even released, the day before this report was released, Max Air was given permission to take to Nigeria skies again. Max Air is still flying. Nothing has changed. These things identified in this report are still active. The people identified in this report are still working on those planes. Nothing has changed.
And do you think anything will change with the current Minister of Aviation, Festus Keyamo? We're going to take a look at a clip of an address he gave at the FEC shortly. But do you have confidence in him and in his ability to make changes in these areas that you've complained about, or that we've, Nigerians
absolutely not. About?
Okay.
Absolutely not. And the simple reason is, first of all, he's what they would refer to as an outsider. He's a the classic round peg in a square hole, right? He's not an aviation industry insider in any way. He knows nothing about aviation. He was given that portfolio almost as an afterthought. He wasn't on the initial list of ministers, if you recall, and he was basically given that thing almost like to settle him for his role during the campaigns. It was compensation. So he is someone who is just there to answer the name of being a federal cabinet minister. But the people within the aviation space, for one thing, they don't have any respect for him. He has no antecedents and no pedigree in the space. And more importantly, what's his motivation for even wanting the job? Right? It's kind of like a similar situation to his predecessor, Hadi Sirika, who, even though he claimed to have been a pilot, as we now know, a lot of his claimed professional history was actually fabricated. such as at least one of the flight schools claims to have attended in the US, which doesn't actually exist, right? When characters like that find their way into positions like the Ministry of Aviation, what they end up doing, like what Hadi Sirika ended up doing, was basically, spending 8 years playing ethnic horse trading and politics and enriching himself. And I don't expect this to be any different because, why would he do any different? So, I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong because, the lives of hundreds, if not thousands of Nigerians are at stake. I'll be the happiest person in the world to be proven wrong, but I expect nothing from him.
Yeah, well, again, these are, very important conversations because, we're talking about lives now of, hundreds of people, maybe even thousands of people. But I once again, of course, just did a quick search and saw, that there's multiple reports every now and then in South Africa of, one plane crashing here or there. It might be a little passenger plane, might be a, tiny, 10-seater plane or something, but there's a couple of all those things. So I'm guessing that's why there's people who would say, oh, David is just fear-mongering, it cannot be, that bad. But I want to also ask, it's a question that I always bring up. If you look at the situation across Nigeria and how it is arguably very dysfunctional in many sectors, in healthcare, in governance, in the judiciary, in our elections, in every other way. It is almost expected that you would find the same thing in the aviation sector. Is it, strange to find, this level of maybe carelessness in Nigeria's aviation sector?
Well, it's not strange because at the end of the day, the wider level of the country around it will always influence what is happening within any individual sector. However, there are certain spaces in any country, regardless of how dysfunctional a country is, there are certain spaces which, whether we like it or not, they must be held sacred. They must be sacrosanct. They must exist at global levels, at global standards, regardless of how dysfunctional the country around them is. Right. So, and I'll give you an example of this. So, Togo it's also a dysfunctional country. It's not even an electoral democracy in the manner that Nigeria purports to be. Togo is, with the exception of maybe electricity, which is fairly stable, Togo is probably even more dysfunctional than Nigeria. And yet, when it comes to its air sector, its aviation sector, Togo has, and this is not an exaggeration. Ethiopian Airlines, which is the largest airline in Africa, the most respected airline in Africa, actually selected Lome as its operational hub in West Africa. Togo has a very well-regulated and a relatively well-developed aviation sector, regardless of how dysfunctional the country around it is, because there are some spaces that must be held sacred, right? So when you're talking about health, when you're talking about aviation, those two things in particular, and maybe education, those kinds of things, you can't leave them to rot along with the rest of the country. You just can't. In the case of aviation, because if you do that, and then we get to the situation which we were in maybe, I think in 2006 or 2007, where Nigerian airspace was actually closed off from much of the outside world. We had the FAA and the US and EASA in Europe actually weren't allowing certain direct flights from Nigeria because Nigerian airspace was considered to be so substandard that Nigerian Airlines couldn't even pass those audits. If you get back to that kind of situation, then we are basically making a bad situation worse, where Nigeria is already going through a series of economic problems. The last thing Nigeria needs is to be cut off even further from the global economy than it already is. Already, in terms of its integration into the global financial system, Nigeria is actually not very well integrated, right? Even compared to its peers like maybe Ghana or Kenya. So where you have your aviation sector, which is like one of the last remaining links or threads you have connecting you to the world, the last thing you want to do is sever that thread, and that's what the NCAA is trying its best to do, David, in the name of preserving the status quo.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I would have loved to hear from you as regards in what exactly has become of Hadi Sirika and if we're going to see any investigations, because these problems didn't just start in this administration. You've tracked and followed the story with the alleged Nigerian airline, that was supposed to have been birthed, but unfortunately it turned out to be some measure of a fraud. So what exactly is going to become of Hadi Sirika? I wish we had time. we look forward to having you again, David. David, there's more to this conversation that we need to have, and we look forward to having you join us again.
Thank you for having me.